In any sport, greatness is difficult to define. Do you look at individual accolades or team achievements? What stats should you value? Does it matter who had the highest peak, or is longevity more important? In climbing, the task is even harder. The sport spans so many different eras and includes so many different disciplines that trying to compare climbers against each other is almost impossible. If you've been following this channel for long enough, you'll know that I once tried to do a top 10 list of the greatest climbers ever, and people were less than happy. The blowback was appropriate. My list sucked. I'm still intrigued by the question though, and so now I'm back, albeit with a slightly different approach. This time, there is no list. I've picked the 7 climbers who I think have convincing arguments for being the greatest of all time, and I'm going to go through them one by one. Some of them are specialists, others dabbled in all areas of the sport. The one thing they all have in common though is that they all have a sense and achievements to their name that no other climber at the time was able to pull off. They each have their own claim to being the greatest climber ever, and I'm gonna lay them out for you one by one. So, inspired by one of my own favorite YouTube series, and to make amends for how bad my first video was, this is my presentation of the 7 best rock climbers in the history of the sport. This is Making the Case, and today, the greatest climber of all time is Lynn Hill. What makes rock climbing unique to me is how many different facets there are of it. You can have 2 climbers, both of who are lifelong participants of the sport, who have almost nothing in common with each other. Take, for example, Tomoe Narasaki and Will Stanhope. Both of them are professional climbers, and both of them are world class, but they're so different from each other that it's basically impossible to say who's better. Lynn Hill is a cheat code. She blows this problem wide open because across her 30 some odd years as a professional climber, she dominated just about every single aspect of rock climbing. She started off as a sport climber, crushing scary routes in J-Tree. She spent time in Yosemite with the Stone Masters, climbing some incredibly difficult routes with very little experience. Then there were the hard trad routes she put up in the Gunks, and the World Cup victories she traded with Catherine Destiville before she took a 9-day hiatus to climb the hardest route ever climbed by a woman. After all that, she returned to her roots in Yosemite Valley with a singular goal in mind. 20 years of climbing progression, training, and culture shifts had come together to create one last, historic ascent for the free climbers to claim, and Lynn Hill wanted to be the first. Let's back up a little bit. Lynn Hill grew up in California and was active from a young age. In her teen years, she discovered climbing and quickly fell in love with it. From the get-go, Lynn was a natural. In a sport that was at the time male-dominated, she learned to use her size, small fingers, and her light weight to find her way up routes that stronger climbers couldn't. It didn't take long before she was traveling to Yosemite to climb, and there she became part of one of the most important aspects of the sport's history: Camp 4, free climbing, and the Stone Masters. Over several summers spent in the valley, her and Mary Gingery ticked off 2 major Yosemite milestones by climbing the nose and then completing the first all-female ascent of the Shield, a notoriously difficult and scary aid climb. It's important to note that they did this with very little big wall or lead experience. Lynn, with her strength and natural feel for rock, was called to lead the hardest pitches. It was also during this time that Lynn learned more about trad climbing, and for the next 8 years, she spent her time mostly as a crack climber, track star, and adventure stunt woman, honing her skills and building her strength alongside John Long. In 1979, Hill had her first major breakthrough with her ascent of Ophir Brook 512D. This was not only the hardest route ever climbed by a woman at the time, but one of the hardest routes in America. It was a breakthrough ascent for Lynn Hill, who was still relatively unknown on the climbing scene. Now, there are people who will say that Lynn was only able to climb this route and a lot of her other crack routes because her thin hands fit better in the thin size cracks. I sort of see the validity behind this argument, but I can't really support it because I never see it applied in the opposite direction. No one delegitimizes action direct because Wolfgang's height helped him make this famous dyno, and no one says that silence didn't count because you need to be tall enough to make this brutal reach. Lynn worked with what she had, same as every other climber does, and she was quickly becoming one of the best around. She moved from the West Coast to New York for school and began putting up some insanely hard lead routes in the Gunks, which included an on-site of yellow crack 12C, and first ascents of Vandals 13A and Taurus Treat 12C. These routes still test climbers to this day, and she was cruising them in single-digit attempts. On these ascents, she showed a level of composure and creativity that was unmatched at the time. Her years of learning to compensate for her lack of size had made her an incredibly skilled, patient, and intelligent climber, and people were starting to take notice. In the mid-1980s, with Lynn's personal life somewhat in turmoil, she decided to move to Europe and try her hand as a competition climber. Although she struggled to adjust to the scoring system, the culture of sexism, and the corruptness that a lot of governing bodies had, she thrived on indoor walls and face climbs. Again, I feel like it's important to highlight just how impressive this is. It would be like seeing Pete Whitaker on an Olympic climbing wall. Despite her reputation as a crack and trad climber, Lynn made the switch to indoor face climbing in the span of a couple of years. It's not like she had no competition either. Over the years she spent in Europe, she went head to head with historically good climbers like Catherine Destiville and Isabelle Petissier, beating both of them as she racked up a series of impressive World Cup wins. Lynn's skill and reputation began to grow, and by the late 1980s, she had earned the reputation as one of the best climbers in the world. In 1990, she cemented this claim with one of her seminal ascents. After being challenged by J.B. Tribault that no woman could top one of his routes, Lynn traveled to France to take on Mass Critique 514A. 9 days later, Lynn Hill became the first woman to ever climb that grade. Again, this is insane to me, not just because of how hard she climbed, but how quickly she did it. It took her 9 days to break into a completely new grade. That's wild. Bibliography took Alex Mego 60 days over 3 years. Nali Hakataival spent 4 years on Burden of Dreams, and even Disbelief, a mere 515B, took Adam Ondra 8 days to climb. This highlights, once again, what makes Lynn Hill the greatest climber of all time. She was so good in so many areas of the sport that it begs to question as to how historically dominant she could have been if she ever focused all her energy on one specialty. In almost every area of climbing she attempted, she became the best in the world at it. It's important to note that it wasn't just the best woman in the world either. Many of her hard ascents in the gunks had turned away the local male legends of the time. Moreover, in the 1990 World Cup, Lynn Hill was the only climber, male or female, to top the final route, despite the fact that other people, including her rival Catherine Destiville, had been given beta beforehand. After a decade of competition and 30 World Cup titles to her name, Lynn retired as a competition climber and returned to the United States. As it stood, her reputation had already been cemented as one of the sport's great. She had climbed the hardest trad routes, the hardest competition routes, and some of the hardest sport routes. There was, however, one crowning ascent left to come. In 1958, after 18 months of effort, Warren Harding topped out on the nose, completing one of the most historic ascents in climbing history. For the next half-decade, and to this day, this route would stand as one of the most iconic in the climbing world, and around the 1990s, some of the best climbers settled in on a goal. They all wanted to be the first person to free climb it. John Long tried and failed. Scott Burke and Simon Naden both tried and failed. It took a few years for her to dial in the beta and get the right partner, but finally, on her second dedicated attempt, Lynn Hill became the first person, male or female, to free climb the most iconic route in the world. Describing the climb, she said that rating the difficulty is almost impossible. The most accurate grade would be to call it once or twice in a lifetime. Turns out that Lynn would do it twice. A year later, she came back and climbed the nose in a day. Not only that, but she only fell once throughout the entirety of the 30 some odd pitches that she had to climb. This achievement would take more than a decade and someone called Tommy Caldwell for it to be repeated. This climb was the crowning jewel in a 30-year career that had spanned every type of rock climbing at the time. When I was researching for this series, that's what really stuck out to me about Lynn Hill. Her ability to be great at everything she did. We've seen stronger climbers, or people with more grades or more historic ascents to their name, but there's never been anyone who, over different points in their life, was the best trad climber, the best sport climber, the best competition climber, and the best big wall climber. Additionally, she did all of this at a time when climbing wasn't particularly inclusive to women, when her support system was thin and she needed to fight for everything that she got. Lynn overcame all of this. When she wasn't given respect, she simply climbed on such a level that she demanded it. I've said a lot about Lynn up to this point, but I think I want to end with a quote from John Long that comes from the preface that he wrote for her autobiography. By and large, Lynn Hill was, and still is when she wants to be, as good as the very best male climbers, which, considering her size, is miraculous. Many climbs favor masculine dimensions, yet even on those wide cracks and reachy face climbs, she can hold her own. On climbs that favor Lynn's stature, especially small hold routes or tricky balance problems, Lynn is untouchable. From hard first ascents in the gunks, to a dominant run of World Cup victories, to mass critique to the nose, Lynn Hill used her creativity, finger strength, and perseverance to climb routes that no one else, man or woman, could do at the time. She's the closest thing we've ever seen to an all-around climber. The sport had never had anything like her before, and we haven't had anything since. She's a once-in-a-lifetime climber, a complete outlier in the sport, and that's what makes her the greatest of all time. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comments what you think. Do you think Lynn Hill has a valid argument as the best climber ever? I'm curious to know. If you want to check out this video a little early, consider supporting me via my Patreon in the link. Thank you as always for watching, and I will see you next time.